know it's a lecture that's going to involve magic tricks, but you don't need to applaud before we even get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's Zangwill lecture. Let me just tell you a little bit about what we're going to see here today. Today's Zangwill lecture is given by Gustav, the Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Plymouth. He's an avid and much respected member of the Magic Circle. And over the years, he's conducted groundbreaking research into the nature of illusion and the delightfully dizzying deceptions of magicians. So we can look forward to that. His fascination is in how the mind can be tricked and what such duplicity reveals about how any of us see the world in our glorious attempts to construct meaningful realities. So there's something to look forward to there. He's held academic positions at Brunel, Goldsmiths, the University of London, and Harvard Medical School, and I don't think that's everything either. And today he's a luminary figure in current research conducted into the science of magic. Gustav is a founding member and president of the Society, the Science of Magic Association, called SOMA, very important group that is, as well as having published 2 acclaimed books, much scientific research, all into the psychology of magic. And indeed, we are very fortunate today to have the man himself here to talk to us right now. Thank you very much.
Hi, Nikki, thank you very much for inviting me here. Do you remember the first time you saw a magic trick? I love magic, and I spent most of my life dedicated to this weird world of illusions and deception. And the first part of my career, I simply used magic as a way of tricking and entertaining people. But for the last 20 years or more, I've been trying to bridge this gap between science and magic, and I've been using magic as a way of exploring the human mind. And so what I would like to do in today's talk is to give you a bit of an overview of how magic can be used to uncover some of the mysteries of the human mind. But to start with, let's have a think about, well, what is magic? Now, at this point, whenever I give these types of lectures, I always leave it up to the audience as to whether they want to just like hear theory or whether they want to have a practical demonstration. So who's for theory? Who's for practical demonstrations? Yeah. And in the 20 years I've asked this question, the answer is always the same. So I'd like to show you the, I'm going to come up here. I'd like to show you the trick that I remember seeing as a kid. And it's called the cut and restored rope. Now the idea is really very simple. You find the middle of this rope, you cut it in half, which leaves you 2 identical, kind of similar pieces of rope. What you do is you take the you know what, I'll show you something different, okay? Actually, with the rope in the beginning and no end. Now, to be honest, there's not really that much I can do with this, so let me just put these ropes. So, should we start again? As I said before, this is the first trick I remember seeing. It's called the cut and restored rope. You cut it in half once, twice. It doesn't really matter how many times you cut it. You take either side, snap your fingers, and voila. It's restored. It's supposed to be educational as well. So, a little puzzle here. If I cut the rope up here and one more time down here, how many pieces of rope do we end up with? 3? 1? It's supposed to be Cambridge. Okay, let's pretend that we're back in primary school. We can count all together. You get 1, 2, 3 equal length of rope. Now watch very carefully. If I take some magic dust from the right side, not from the left, but from the right, and sprinkle it over these ropes, watch what happens. I end up with a short piece of rope, a medium length rope, and a long piece of rope. Now, as I said before, it's very important to take the magic dust from the right, because if you take it from the left and sprinkle it over these ropes, they all become of equal length again. Are you confused? Yeah? You don't know how it's done?
Yes.
Now, I know it looks like I've got supernatural powers, but of course I don't. All I'm doing is I'm using psychological tricks to trick your mind. And as we've learned more about how the human mind works, we've come to realize that all of our experience is just an illusion. So as a magician, all I'm doing is I'm pointing out this discrepancy between reality and this illusion. And of course, to do so, I often use a bit of theatrics and a lie. So at the beginning, did you think I messed up the trick? I didn't. That was just a lie. That was just kind of like to get you emotionally involved in the whole thing. When I said it's important to take the magic dust from the right side, was that real? No, that was a lie, because the dust from the left works just as well. And even now, as I say, I've got 1, 2, 3 equal length of rope. I'm lying through my teeth, because in reality, one of these is a short one. This one here is a medium, and this one here is the long piece of rope. Thank you. So that's the entertaining bit. Now comes the boring stuff. So, what is magic? Well, magic is a performance art that allows you to experience things that are impossible. Like you all know that it's impossible to cut a rope in half and then magically restore it, and yet that's exactly what you've experienced. Now, of course, magicians don't have supernatural powers, and what they are doing is they're using lots of clever psychological tricks to give the illusion that what you are seeing is real. And so if you think about magic from a psychological perspective, it elicits an interesting emotion and an interesting conflict between the things that you experience and the things that you believe to be possible. So you've got certain beliefs about the physical world, beliefs about the nature of ropes, and that belief is conflicted as I'm cutting the rope in half and magically restoring it. And so, as scientists, what we try to do is we try to use these tricks and these illusions to uncover some of the mysteries of the mind. Of course, this is something that psychologists often do. As psychologists, we're interested in errors, interested in lesions. So for example, blind sight. Blind sight can tell us a lot about visual perception, and these perceptual errors can inform us about how normal perception works. And we can think of magic as a similar process where you are almost artificially inducing some of these lesions, and by understanding why people are susceptible to these types of illusions, that can potentially tell us something interesting about cognition. Now, I'm not the first to have made this claim. This idea of using scientific principles to study the human mind dates back to sort of like some of our founders in psychology. So, for example, Alfred Binet, who's better known for his work on intelligence testing, he had a keen interest in studying experts. So he would study mathematicians, athletes, and he studied these experts to find out more about normal cognition. And in doing so, he also realized that, well, magicians have got really interesting skills to manipulate what people do, how they perceive the world, and how they think. So at the time, he invited some of the most eminent French magicians into his laboratory at the Sorbonne and studied some of these principles. And in doing so, he discovered some really interesting things. So forcing principles, for example, so a force is a principle that magicians use to influence your decision-making. So one of these old forces, you have a newspaper, ask people to just point somewhere in that newspaper, and what they found was that most people would point towards the center of the paper, but they felt that this was a genuinely free decision, and Binet at the time came up with this idea of cognitive laziness. lots of decisions that we make, and we simply make them because we are lazy. And we've been actually studying a lot of these principles more recently in the lab as well. Some of my favourites, Max Dessoir, he was a philosopher, also amateur magician, and he studied mostly sort of like magic texts. And by doing so, he actually uncovered some really intriguing phenomena about perception. And I think a lot of these have been largely forgotten. He was one of the first psychologists to come up with this idea of inattentional blindness, for example. He also noticed this difference between overt and covert attention. Other eminent figures, Norman Triplett, again, he became more involved in social psychology. He wrote a massive paper trying to categorize lots of magic tricks. But he also conducted some of the earliest experiments on magic. He was actually the magician who inspired me to look at this connection by coming up with an illusion which is now known as the vanishing ball illusion. So in this illusion, you throw a ball up in the air a couple of times, and the final throw, you just pretend to throw it up, and it sort of magically disappears somewhere between the ceiling and the magician. And he came up with this idea of these positive hallucinations, and not just negative hallucinations, so that would be like just sort of inattentional blindness, but also positive hallucinations that could be experienced in our everyday life. So around this time, there was a real flurry of studying magic in the laboratory, but then suddenly the science of magic really died away. Now, in some ways that's really surprising, but of course sort of like that may coincide with a general shift in approaches to psychology. So suddenly the study of consciousness, the study of internal representations became less fashionable. It was replaced by behaviorism. And actually, even if you look at sort of like really hot topics today, like consciousness, these are all topics that weren't necessarily being studied anymore. But a lot of this then changed at sort of like around 2008. And 2008, I think, forms a really important year in the science of magic because two important papers were being published. So on the one hand, Stephen Macknick and his colleagues, they published a paper that argued that actually scientists could learn a lot from studying magicians and that magic can tell us a lot about attention, awareness, and consciousness. Their approach was very much neuroscientific. They also coined this term neuromagic. Now, Ron Renzik and I, we sort of like within the same week, we published a paper in Trends in Cognitive Science entitled Towards the Science of Magic. And we took this sort of like broader and argued that actually kind of like this sort of like magic allows us, so we'd be able to study the science of magic, or study magic and create the science of magic that could apply a lot of these principles and the experiences that magic elicits to a whole range of topics, again, to look at this in more detail. And in 2015, Ron and I, we published another paper, sort of like a more worked out paper, that called for a formal science of magic. Now, if you actually look at the number of papers that have been published on magic, so Matt Tompkins puts together this graph. He keeps a really nice tally on the number of papers that are published on magic. You can see there was sort of like a little flurry around 1900, then literally virtually nothing. But within the last 15 years or so, over 150 papers have been published that are looking at different aspects of magic. Now, up to now, this sounds like a really sort of like harmonious research area, but there have been quite a lot of debates within this as well. One of the big debates was really with one of my best friends and collaborator, Jeff Cole. I have spent the last 20 years or more trying to promote the science of magic, and I've argued that actually there's a lot that scientists can learn from studying magicians. Jeff, who we've published papers together as well, is more skeptical about it. He was going to write this paper basically arguing that the science of magic is really very much a failed endeavor and there's not really that much that can be learned from magic. Now, I guess kind of like if you're faced with a situation like that, there's two ways in which you can go about. You can break up your friendship and you can publish your kind of rivalry papers in different journals. We didn't really want to do that. So instead, what we did was we decided actually maybe this would be a great opportunity for us to come together and co-author a paper to try and sort of like battle out some of these ideas within this one paper, which has recently been published in Current Directions in Psychology. So what I would like to do now is sort of like take you through some of these ideas and use this as a framework to tell you about some of the research that we've been doing in the Magic Lab. So, if we then look at the science of magic, the science of magic rests on what we identified as being three key components. And on some of these components, we agreed. On others, we had really rather differing views. So let me now kind of like present some of these components. The first one, which is probably the least controversial of these premises, is that magic may provide us with a great research tool. A tool that can be used independent of the art of magic itself. Now, deception lies at the center of magic. Deception is something that we use in a lot of our experiments as well. And so magic, and sort of like some of these magic principles, may therefore provide us with a rather valuable tool to be implemented in some of our experimental research. That's one of the premises where Jeff and I sort of like tended to agree on, and there wasn't really that much disagreement on this. A more controversial premise we coined the insight hypothesis. Now, magic is an ancient art form. Now, we don't know that much about the early origins of magic, but I'm confident that at least 600 years ago, magicians were performing fairly sophisticated magic tricks. Now, every magic trick that you perform acts a bit like an experiment, where you may have an idea about how your trick works. You don't perform the trick in front of your audience. If your theory about the trick is right, the audience is fooled. If it's wrong, the trick will be spotted. And in doing so, that sort of like allows magicians to acquire lots of real-world knowledge about the human mind. And so in doing so, magicians, it's been claimed, have acquired lots of real-world experience and knowledge about the ease by which humans can be manipulated. So we call this the insight hypothesis, and I'll get back to this later on. The most controversial premise we've called the deconstruction principle. This basically argues that there might be something really interesting in some of the principles or the techniques that magicians use to deceive their audiences, as well as the illusions that magic can elicit. And so by studying some of these principles, psychologists could potentially gain new insights into the human mind. And this is really the premise where Jeff and I started off really disagreeing on. I think we've sort of like come closer together. So what I would like to do now is look at these three different premises in isolation and give you some concrete examples of how this can actually be done in practice. So let's start with the least controversial one, namely using magic as a tool to study the human mind. Now, of course, this is nothing new. Like, psychologists have often been using this. So if you think about the preferential looking task in sort of like developmental psychologists, so here in a classic task, you basically, let's see if I can use this. So looking at object permanency, you have an infant and you habituate them to a normal situation where a screen will kind of like just flip over on the table. You then place a box in front of the screen, and that leads to two different situations. So you've got a possible event, so nothing special happens, where the screen is now stuck on the box. And then here you've got an impossible event. You may also want to call this a magic trick, where the screen magically penetrates through the box. Now, of course, in this situation, we're interested in how long do infants engage with these different situations. You are measuring their surprise. That's really very similar to what you're doing in a magic trick. So how then can we use magic as a tool? I'd like to give you a couple of examples. This is a lot of the sort of like the current research that we've been using in our conducting in our lab. One of the cool things about using magic as a tool is that you can do things that would otherwise seem impossible. So in one line of research, we've been looking at, well, to what extent can we get people to believe in technological devices that are just simply impossible? And to what extent can we use these kind of devices to change people's cognitive processes? So in a typical card trick or magic trick, I might ask you to think of something, and I then use my magical skills to work out what you were thinking of, or I might claim that I can influence your thought patterns. So in this project, we've been seeing whether we can use these type of magic tricks to create placebo devices that could change people's creative thought. So what we do in these experiments, we've got the experimenter here who tells our participants that we've got this really new advanced neurostimulation device that allows us to make people more creative. In reality, it's just a bit of plastic with some blue tack. We've got some wires attached to a box that doesn't really work, and that's then plugged into our computer, which displays some brain functions. But here comes the clever bit, in that we sort of like say, well, okay, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to calibrate this device just to your particular brain frequency. And to do so, we're going to use a little number task. The computer will randomly generate a number, and it will influence your thought processes. So the experimenter then writes the number on their piece of paper. They hit a button, you can hear some noise, and the participant is asked to think of a number, to sort of name the first number that comes to mind, and as if through magic, that number matches. So this is a normal magic trick, but what we are doing here is we are packaging this up in sort of like a neuroscience. And so what we're trying to do is seeing, well, to what extent can these placebo devices actually be used to change people's cognitive processes? So in the actual experiment, it's got sort of like three stages. So in the first stage, we convince people that this device does genuinely work by using these magic tricks. We then have two different phases. So we've got a baseline. So here we just told, okay, now this machine is inert. It's not doing anything. It's just measuring your brain activation. In the stimulation situation, we just tell participants, now we're going to turn it on, and it's going to stimulate your brain to make you more creative. And so what we're interested in is, well, are people more creative when they're told that their brains are being stimulated? Well, how do you measure creativity? We use different measures. So we can just ask them, well, how creative are you feeling whilst you're doing this task? But we can also use more standardized measures as well. So one of them is an alternative uses task. So we just ask them, we give them a word, so for example, cup, and they have 3 minutes to come up with the most uses for this task, for this object. And we then measure, well, how many uses do they come up with? So that tells us about sort of like their fluency. But we can also measure how unique some of these responses are. So that will give us a measure of originality. We can also sort of measure their convergent creativity. And so to do so, we use the RAT, so the remote association test. So here, if I give you 3 words, cottage, Swiss, and cake, can you think of a word that combines them? Cheese. So cheese would be the word. So they're given kind of like about 10 of these to fill out, to solve as well, either during a baseline condition or when they're told they're being stimulated. Of course, in reality, nothing actually happens. So, does this work? Well, first of all, is it plausible? These are all psychology students, and here's the data in terms of plausibility And you can see the majority of our students do generally think that this is plausible, which is really encouraging. So what this tells us then is we can use this kind of illusionism to create a device that people do actually genuinely believe could work. But does it have any impact on creativity? Well, how creative do they feel? So if we just ask them to introspect, our participants do feel significantly more creative when they're being told that their brains are being stimulated than when it's just being used as a baseline. We also ask them to report any physiological sensations, and that's where we get the biggest effect, that people do report more physiological sensations like tinglings on the electrodes when they're being told that the device is being turned on. What about their actual performance then? So here, the data is not quite as clear. If we look at their fluency, so this is how many different uses they can come up, we do get a significant difference. So the people do come up with more uses when they're told they're being stimulated to be more creative. In terms of the originality, there's a difference there, but it's not significant. And in terms of the remote dissociation test as well, sort of like the results are going in the predicted direction, but the difference is not quite significant yet. So this is sort of encouraging evidence for us that we could potentially use these sort of like use illusionism and use magic tricks to create these placebo devices. And we're also applying this in lots of other domains as well, so using street tasks and attention measures to see whether we can use this type of illusionism to change some of these cognitive functions. Now, for me, one of the things that I find really interesting about this, and sort of like one of the really promising things, avenues to then follow with this, is that magic is quite unique in that even though you know that what you are seeing isn't real, it kind of feels real. And so what we'd like to do is maybe see whether we can then use these type of illusionism procedures to actually create open placebos. So actually where we can actually tell participants, look, it only feels real, it's not actually real, and see whether this can still have a positive impact. And some of the research from sort of like other labs on children does seem to suggest that that is possible. So far we kind of like just looked at principles that are being used, sort of like those deceptive principles. What about the experiences that are being elicited? Again, magic is unique in that I can create experiences that are completely impossible or magical. Now, of course, magicians are not the only individuals who do this. Mediums, spiritualists often use similar kind of principles to give the illusion that they can communicate with dead people or the spirit world. Now, magic provides a great tool to measure some of these beliefs, and we've conducted lots of research in which I've done most of that research at Goldsmiths. We do this in big lecture theatres, and we use magic tricks to create seances, and we create these spiritualist experiences. So just using magic tricks to give the illusion that we can communicate with dead people. Now, for me, this has been sort of like some of the most unsettling experiments that I have ever conducted, just because of the ease by which you can actually get people to genuinely believe that what they are seeing is real. To the extent that we conducted a big study in Lausanne in front of about 400 students. Initially, what we were interested in is looking at the long-term impact that some of these demonstrations could have. And we didn't think it was going to be that effective. But at the end of the demonstration, about 40 students came up to the magicians and they wanted the magician to contact their dead people, their dead relatives as well, that we felt actually from an ethical point of view, we really had to pull the plug on this and debunk the whole thing. We've also been using this as a way of looking at the impact that misinformation can have on people's beliefs. And again, in the context of spirituality and so spiritual beliefs, it's a great tool to look at broader concepts of misinformation. And again, kind of like what we found throughout a lot of these experiments is that even if you tell your participants that what they are seeing is not real, that they're just watching a magic trick, most of our participants still believe that these phenomena are genuine. In actual fact, just telling people that what you're seeing is fake has very little impact on their interpretations. And again, kind of like, so I think kind of like magic provides a great way of examining the impacts that some of this misinformation can have on our beliefs. So more generally, we've been using magic as a way of priming other beliefs as well. So in a lot of mentalism, so mentalism is a genre in magic that deals with mind reading. I can give you the illusion that I can influence your thoughts, and I can give the illusion that you generally don't have any free will. And so what we've been doing is kind of like using video. So in sort of like in a lot of the free will research, if you want to prime someone to change their beliefs, you get them to read a text. Those texts are often not that effective. So we've created sort of like online magic tricks where you genuinely feel that you don't have any control over the things that you're doing. It's all just an illusion. And we can use that to independently actually change people's beliefs in free will as well. We're doing research on deception and lying as well. Again, sort of like, but I'm not going to kind of like talk too much about this. The final thing I would like to talk about is the link between magic and technology. Now, Arthur C. Clarke famously claimed that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And like with some of these magical experiences, magic is great in that we can create things that are simply not possible yet. Now again, there's quite a long history of this, and throughout history there's been a close link often between technology, engineering and magicians. So in 1750s, Wolfgang von Kempelen, he came up with this really beautiful illusion which is known as the chess playing Turk. Now, in this illusion, the illusion itself hasn't survived, it got burnt, but this is a reconstruction of the illusion. There was this Turk who could automatically move. So in the illusion itself, so in the performances, Wolfgang would sort of like show the different compartments open, just to reveal lots of cogs and sort of like mechanical devices. You would never see this little guy inside. The doors were then shut, and they would press start, and the Turk could move by himself. Not only that, so he couldn't just move, but he could also think, and he thought really well in that he was able to play chess against most chess masters. Famously, he beat Napoleon, who got really pissed off about being beaten by what we would now call a robot. Now, of course, this was just an illusion, because in reality there was actually a guy hidden inside, and the illusion is beautiful. I mean, it's such a clever illusion. So you had a guy hidden inside the box. He would slide around so that you could actually show it empty. Now he had to have light as well to be able to see inside, so they had a candle to get rid of the smoke. This is why the Turk would actually smoke a pipe as well, so there was a bit of smoke that would be removed. That could be removed like that. But for 40 years, Wolfgang von Kempelen travelled through Europe performing this illusion, kind of like mostly in prestigious courts, and nobody really knew whether it was real or not. I mean, he performed it as real, so this is kind of like a real machine. And I think this elicits some really interesting thoughts, because of course this was sort of like during the time of the Industrial Revolution. We were just getting used to the fact that machines could suddenly kind of like do manual labour much faster, but also of higher quality than we could. But what about thinking? I mean, is thinking something that is just restricted to humans, or could machines do this? And indeed, kind of like Turing, in his developments, he kind of like took some of the inspirations from the chess playing Turk, as to kind of like to see, well, what could machines ever be able to think? Now, of course, we know that they can, but we are trying to take this a step further. So what about if robots can actually do things that really seem completely impossible now? What about if a robot could really read your mind? So we've got Pepper the robot. He's a really cool robot. He's great at interacting. He can follow where you look. He's very good at articulating his arms as well when he speaks, but he's pretty stupid because you have to kind of program everything. Not if we add a bit of magic to this. So what we've done is we've programmed Pepper to be able to read people's minds. So again, rather than just having a magic trick, this time our participants get to think of a number. The magician or the experimenter can work out what number that is. We then feed that back into Pepper, and you get the illusion that Pepper can genuinely read your mind. Now, it's quite hard to just describe this in words because the experience of having your mind read by a robot is truly weird. I mean, this is a very new experiment. We've only just started running this about 3 weeks ago. And I wrote the script. I knew exactly what was going on. And I felt quite freaked out by Pepper reading my mind. And so one of the things that we're looking at within this is how these experiences can change our beliefs and our trust in AI and robotics. And so we're comparing this of when you're actually reading your mind compared to just sort of like doing much more trivial tasks such as answering a trivial pursuit question. So hopefully I've given you a bit of an insight here of how, and this is kind of like just a small section of how magic techniques can be used in experimental designs to create interesting studies and to help us. Are there any questions so far? So let's now look at the second premise, namely the insight hypothesis. Performing magic has certainly provided magicians with experience of how their trick works. And one of the central arguments in the science of magic has been that magicians may possess a particular insight into some of these psychological principles. And indeed, I mean, when I sort of like started a lot of this research nearly 20 years ago, that was one of the premises that I did generally believe in. And indeed, if we kind of like look at the literature, so these are kind of like some of the claims that have been made. So magicians possess intuitive knowledge about the rules governing human cognition. Magicians' knowledge can be superior to that of the neuroscientists. Neuroscientists are just beginning to catch up again from the McNick group and so on. So, I mean, even at the time when some of these claims were made, I sort of like felt really rather skeptical. And I think kind of like some of these claims also have not been particularly helpful in terms of bridging this gap between scientists and magicians. So do magicians generally have great insights about how their tricks work? Well, in some cases they may. So when Alice Ballet joined me in my lab for her PhD, she was really interested in the priming force. So a force is a principle that magicians use to influence your choice. But she was interested in a force that was developed by Derren Brown. Now, in this force, you use prime, so you get to think of a number. I'm not going to show you the video, but you kind of like prime the card by showing a diamond like this, and then priming the 3, so go boom, boom, boom as well. And the idea is that these types of primes could be used to get people to think of the 3 of diamonds. Now, my background was in implicit learning. I did my PhD with Zoltan Dines. I was very skeptical about a lot of these priming phenomena, and my intuition, my scientific intuition, there's no way that this is ever going to work. I was completely wrong. We replicated this several times, and even though it's not perfect, but consistently about 20% of participants, when you ask them then to come up with a card, they come up with the 3 of diamonds. It's a really effective force. Like if you think like a chance would be about 2%. So this is an instance where I was really very surprised that this principle would work. But just because magicians may know what tricks work doesn't necessarily mean they've got greater insights into the human mind. And we've become a lot more skeptical about this. So Alice and I, we wrote a book for magicians that actually encourage magicians to use a more data-driven approach to evaluate some of their principles. And again, I'm going to just give you a couple of examples where magicians are actually wrong. So in card magic, if I perform a card trick, there's lots of ways in which I can ask you to select the card. I could ask you to cut to a card, I could ask you to pick a card, or I could ask you to name a card. Now you might wonder, well, why do they have so many different selection techniques? Well, each of these selection techniques has got different properties and allows me to manipulate your choice in a different way. But generally, if you ask magicians, and we ran surveys on this, magicians would think that if you ask someone to just freely name a card, that should be the freest selection. So if I just ask you to name a card, that our participants should feel that there's no way that I can influence your decision and that selection is completely free. Now, from a magician point of view, that makes sense because there's lots of ways in which I can manipulate the card, and it is actually very difficult for a magician to manipulate or to force a card that is simply named. But is this true? Well, it turns out it's not. So we carried out some experiments where we asked participants to either they would pick a card or they would name a card. And actually, if you look here, so in terms of sort of like the influence, so they felt that if for the physical selection, they had the magician had less influence over the card that they would come up. And they also felt that cards that were physically selected felt freer than those that were verbally selected. So this is a clear instance where actually the data does not support magicians' insight. We then also kind of like, so this is exactly the same magic trick. The only difference is that half the participants got to see the magic trick in which the card was physically selected. The other half the participants got to see the magic trick in which it was verbally selected. And actually, if you look at sort of like different emotions that the trick elicits, it's really very similar as well. So it's not that a verbal selection is simply better. Another central premise in the magic literature is this idea that a magic trick that happens in the spectator's hand has a special status. So lots of magic tricks are sold on the basis that the magic happens inside the spectator's hands. Again, we tested this using a magic trick in which either card changed in the spectator's hands or it changed elsewhere. You don't have to look at kind of like all of the data. There's basically no difference. So this and lots of other data also suggests that, well, magicians may not necessarily have a full understanding of how and why their tricks work. So although they know what tricks kind of like work well, they don't necessarily have an insight into why these tricks work. And that's really where the science is required, because magicians are just as susceptible to a lot of the cognitive biases that will lead to some of these reasoning errors. Now, I guess we've kind of like, as an outsider, there's another problem, especially if you're not particularly, if you're not that experienced in magic, in that magicians often lie about what they are doing. Now, magic is based on deception, but quite often magicians will claim that they're doing something which is not necessarily the truth. Now, I remember when I was doing my PhD, that was just when Derren Brown became big. I remember Zoltan, who's really kind of like one of the smartest people I know, true authority on anything to do with implicit processes, came up to me afterwards and said, look, did you see Derren Brown? It's really amazing, kind of like some of the priming that he did. And I was like, Zoltan, you know that was a trick. None of that is real. So in a performance, I guess magicians have got a license to lie about what they are doing, but what you do quite often come across as well is like TED Talks where magicians claim that they're using a particular principle when in fact they're actually using something completely different. So I guess the reason why I'm putting this up here is do be cautious. Like, don't take everything that a magician says at face value. Like, if you're going to talk to Clive, Clive's not going to lie to you. But if you're kind of like just going to read or see a performance, be cautious. So So yeah, we can't take magicians' insight at face value. That's really where data is necessary. So the final premise that I would like to look at, and this is the one where Jeff and I really kind of like the biggest arguments about, is the deconstruction principle. Namely, the idea that actually maybe by studying some of these principles, by some of these deceptive principles, as well as the illusions themselves, that could potentially reveal some interesting insights about human cognition. Now, I've done quite a lot of work on this. So, for example, the vanishing ball illusion. So, as I mentioned before, this is an illusion initially kind of like developed by Norman Triplett over 100 years ago. Magician pretends to throw a ball up in the air, and you see a ball move up and then disappear somewhere up here. Now, I think this is a really interesting perceptual phenomena, and I can't really explain exactly why it works. It seems very different to some of the other perceptual phenomena like representational momentum also. So I think kind of like these types of illusions could potentially provide us with interesting insights into visual perception. I'd like to talk about another principle which I think is super interesting, which is this idea of multiple layers of deception. So in most magic tricks, you don't just use one layer of deception. You use lots of different layers of deception that are all cleverly combined. Now, within magic, this is generally known as the veil principle. So according to the veil principle, one form of deception may be somewhat transparent, but if you then kind of like layering all of these different forms of deception on top of each other, it becomes completely impenetrable. So we tested this in the lab using a really stupid magic trick. So in the magic trick, the experimenter could sort of like go through cards and could just name the card. And there was two different versions or three different versions, really. Kind of like one, the cards were face down. The magician would take a card and then would be able to name it. How do you think he did it? Memorization. They were shuffled before.
Something on the back of the card?
Yeah, just marked cards. Quite simple. In another condition, the cards were face up, but he wore a blindfold, but he could still name the cards. How do you think it was done? Not feeling?
Is it transparent?
Yeah, just a transparent blindfold. You could just peek through the blindfold. It's really not that hard. The interesting thing is when he's using kind of like facing down cards and a blindfold. So here the two methods are being combined. So how do our participants do? Well, if you've got the marked cards, 60% of participants could work out that they were marked cards. It's really not that hard. Pretty poor form of deception. The blindfold, face up, again, about 60% of our participants could work out how it's done. But what happens if you combine the two? So face down cards and the blindfold, only about 3% of the participants could actually work out how it's done. So you've got two really poor forms of deception, but then suddenly put together and people struggle to work through this. Now, what's really interesting is that you could quite often get people who actually kind of like work out the face down, work out the blindfold. So individually they can work out the two methods, but they simply can't put these two methods together, which I think kind of like can tell us something quite interesting about human reasoning. The effects themselves, I think, by studying them, could be quite interesting. Have you ever thought of what it'd be like to experience magic if you're blind? Now, most magic tricks rely on vision. And that's kind of weird, because there's just as many auditory illusions as there are visual illusions, and yet it's virtually impossible, I would say it's impossible to create a magic trick that just relies on sound alone, not speech. And we tested this. We also came up with a competition, so we called for magicians to come up with a trick that only relies on auditory cues. It seems to be pretty much impossible. And so again, I think maybe magic can tell us something quite interesting about the differences between vision and hearing. But maybe the magic tricks themselves as well. Like, there's lots of different magic tricks, and science has often advanced by coming up with taxonomies that look at similarities between different animals or kind of like body parts as well. So here we've got kind of like biological taxonomies that are based on similarity. What about magic tricks? Can we do the same with magic as well? Because by definition, magic involves violations in our beliefs about the world. And so maybe sort of like some of these similarities between these different magic tricks could tell us something interesting about our beliefs about the world itself. So we did this. It's been a long project, trying to come up with every possible magic trick or principle, and then we use similarity ratings. And Tom Griffith, the math is way beyond my skill, but basically came up with this dendrites. So what this tells us then is sort of like the higher the bars, the more similar they are. And you don't need to be able to read all of this, but what's clear is that we get some really nice structures here. Sort of like one of the biggest differences is between mentalism. So these are mind reading tricks, and sort of like other magic tricks that involve sort of like manipulating the physical properties of objects themselves. So I think kind of like this, looking at the similarity and the differences between some of these magical effects could potentially reveal some interesting insights into our beliefs about the world itself. So this has been quite a whistle-stop tour through a lot of the research that we've been doing kind of like on magic, but I guess I'd like to sort of like just like three sort of like key take-home messages. For one, I think magic provides us with really useful tools that can be implemented in a lot of research methodologies. And in this case here, what you are investigating is completely independent of the magic itself. It's just the magic is being used as a tool. In terms of the insight hypothesis, well, do magicians generally have unique insights into human cognition? Well, I think this is where we have to be a little bit more cautious. I think magicians have got really interesting ideas about deception, about effects, but we can't take this knowledge just at face value. I think it's a great starting point, but we do need more scientific and data-driven approaches to then afterwards evaluate some of these ideas. In terms of the deconstruction principle, this is where after nearly 2 years of arguing, Jeff and I are still really good friends. And I think he too has come around to this idea that actually by investigating some of these deceptive principles, but also the effects themselves that magic can elicit, this may illuminate some interesting insights into the human mind. So this just leads me to thank a lot of the people who've been working in the lab and my collaborators as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gustav. That was very informative, very interesting, very entertaining talk on a subject that I think we're all very interested in. Lots of points raised there. I wonder if anybody has any questions for Gustav right now in our last moments.
So we know that there are some people who are less susceptible to kind of social norms and understandings about the world, particularly people who are neurodivergent with ADHD or autism. Has any of your work looked at whether, similarly I guess to the idea that blind people aren't susceptible to magic, has any of your work looked at whether neurodevelopmental differences influence how people perceive magic?
Yeah, so we did publish a paper on the vanishing ball illusion, actually looking at autism. So I think the vanishing ball illusion is really interesting in that it relies on two different cues that individuals with autism should actually be less susceptible to. For one, it relies on social cues. So the illusion only works if I look up when I'm doing the trick. But also this idea that actually kind of like maybe kind of like individuals with autism be less susceptible to some of these illusions. And we did do this as an eye tracking study. The problem was the results were completely the opposite way around, and actually kind of like the individuals with autism were more susceptible. But there's probably a different reason for this, because what we found was actually they were using the social cues, but they were much slower at using them. And so our hypothesis is that actually they struggled to distinguish. So in the illusion, you throw the ball up once for real, twice for real, and then a third trial, it disappears. that they never had a proper comparison in terms of visual representation between when the ball is actually going up compared to when it didn't go up, and so that could have potentially led to the higher susceptibility level. But I think kind of like using magic as a stimuli could provide great insights into some of these differences. It's just that was a study where, it was really very much counter to our predictions.
Tristan, you could have a question?
Yeah, in cognitive methodology, in theory of methodology, in cognition, there's always this clash between the cognitive domains that you see in the textbooks and what the task we come up with really test from those domains, right? And many times we, create a cognitive test that is a bit more complicated and tests more things that we think is testing. And you go back and try to tease apart and try to control everything, etc., which of course in the magic trick is more difficult because you don't have that many degrees of freedom because you have to put the layers and be able to capture the trick. But I got really excited when you show the nice sort of classification of the tricks, because I thought, well, from a cognitive perspective, you could try to fit cognitive domains and cognitive aspects in every of those magic classifications. So the question is that part of the plan?
Yeah, well, I haven't bored you. I love taxonomies, so I have got a taxonomy of misdirection, which basically does exactly that. So it looks at kind of like so the taxonomy of misdirection distinguishes between perceptual processes, memory processes, and reasoning processes. And what that tries to do is map some of these magic principles on these more known sort of like cognitive processes. We've also got a taxonomy on forcing as well, which tries to do similar things as well. So I think that's really is necessary for several reasons. For one, it kind of like helps us to identify some of the mechanisms that may be involved. But also, for me, there's sort of like another objective of this is that it's very hard for non-magicians to actually access a lot of this information. And so by having these taxonomies and by being able to establish some of these links, hopefully that will actually kind of like make non-magicians be able to acquire or sort of like to study some of these principles. That's something that we've done a lot. Actually just at the moment, we are working on a taxonomy of reasoning misdirection as well, which is a really complicated thing, but hopefully kind of like in a few years, we'll get that.
Vicky?
Following on from Chris's question, with these taxonomies, would it be valuable to think about how they also tap onto a taxonomy of cognitive biases? So I'm thinking like egocentric bias and all those kinds of different types of implicit bias, but at the same time also looking at it in terms of embodiment. Obviously you and I have talked a lot about the fact that many of these effects rely on an opposable thumb, for example, whether those kinds of processes, so both the in the mind shortcuts and the physical shortcuts based on the assumptions we make about how our own bodies move, how that would fit onto the taxonomy of the magic effects?
Yeah, definitely. I guess a lot of this is really early stages for a lot of this, and our taxonomies are pretty crude. We haven't got there yet, but I think like a lot of that embodiment would probably form a really important part. I'm especially thinking like this whole idea of naturalness, which is something that magicians often talk about, and I think particularly kind of like within sort of the idea of naturalness, a lot of this embodiment will play a really important part.
I think one of the things that you said earlier on I thought was very interesting, that magicians don't necessarily know how their own effects work. And I think that's from my experience of magicians, they often don't. They simply read the instructions and they're delighted when it does work.
Yeah.
But there are so many magicians who've been working for so long that we do know the effects that they do, which do astound us. And so they instantly show themselves as being effects that we should be looking at more closely, because they may well reveal something very interesting about how cognition works. And
the other real advantage as well is that the effects are huge. That's sort of like that for me. That was from having done my PhD in implicit learning, where I was sort of dealing with really, really subtle effects, kind of very well designed experiments and the stimuli had to be very carefully designed, moving into an area where you just have these massive effects, because as a magician, to fool your audience, the effect has to be pretty powerful. And so that gives you quite a lot of scope to play around with as well. So, but quite often we don't know why they work.
My question is about illusions. So you have the Turk in the chessboard. How is that different from like a plain lie, because he was just in the box, to an actual illusion, which is something you see and you fall for? Because I felt like they're not quantifiably different. Like,
sorry, from the difference
so
between
a lie, just a plain lie, me telling you that something is somewhere, and
Yeah.
you're falling for me telling you because you're just lying to me, and an illusion. So I don't see the quantifiable difference between the two.
Well, I guess the difference, the difference, like with the Turk, the difference is that I could just say the box is empty.
Yeah.
And then you go, I don't believe you. I think there's someone inside.
Yeah.
So that me telling you that it's empty, that relies on trust. It becomes an illusion where I can open a box and I can demonstrate that the box is empty. Then you can see, and you've got evidence of the box being empty. And there's a lot of interesting illusions. I'm going to just try. So Fabian Eckrol has done some great work on some of the perceptual illusions. So this is sort of like the illusion of absence. So if I tell you like, my hand is empty here, it just looks empty. Even though I'm hiding a coin here. And even if you know that the coin is here, it's actually quite hard to imagine that the coin is here. So this is a really interesting psychological illusion, because even though you know it's not just about imagination, you're actually genuinely seeing emptiness as well. So there are some illusions that are, that kind of go beyond sort of like just your beliefs about the world. Like you know how it's done, and yet you still feel that it's real.
So great talk. Ethical issues aside, when you were talking about placebo and manipulating in a way, augmenting, I guess, placebo with deception or magic, have you considered in terms of, let's say, therapeutic effect or stuff that is beyond, creativity?
Yeah, creativity, we just use this as a cognitive function. Jay Olson's done some really interesting work on kids, where they had a mock, actually they had a much fancier setup. They had a mock fMRI scanner, but used the same principle and used that for kids in a therapeutic context. Now, I think the exciting thing here is this idea of being able to use placebo in a more ethical way, in that we can, if we can get to a point, like so in that study, the children were told that it's not real, and yet it still had a therapeutic effect. Now, that was kids. I don't know whether it would also work with adults, but that's sort of like the ultimate aim really of this. And if we can do this, then I think that would be really exciting. But I do think that is sort of like something that I find really exciting about magic. I mean, it's like with Pepper the Robot. I mean, it felt weird. Like I wrote every word of that script. I knew exactly what was happening, and yet it still felt quite real. So potentially I think some of these principles, in future could also be used sort of like in a therapeutic context, but long term, but also ethically, in that we can be honest about the deception that we are using, but it still feels real.
Has there been much research done into whether there's a group effect, like to when you're actually percepting the magic? So like comparing how someone would see it when there's a live audience and there's many people who are also excited by it, compared to just showing it one-to-one. Is there much of a difference in that?
We have tried to touch on this, but we failed to really find a proper answer to it. Anecdotally, I would argue there certainly is an effect, particularly in the context when we do these spiritualist readings. It's quite hard to put in words just how unsettling it is to do these kind of experiments, because the kind of power that you potentially have in manipulating people, and I think a lot of that has got to do with the sort of the group dynamics in the room. Like if you just do this in a one-to-one I think people were being more skeptical, but there is sort of like, there's a lot of interesting group dynamics that go on in a lot of these experiments, like having the mass. And again, I mean, you have that a lot with sort of a lot of these evangelical sort of like demonstrations, like in a church, kind of like all of that, all of the sort of the social atmosphere can play a really important role as well. But we haven't looked at, I did run a study once where I tried to do this very artificially by having people sitting next to, either people watched a magic trick where there were people reacting to it and you could hear applause as well, compared to just in isolation. But we didn't really find anything. But I also wonder whether some of that has changed a little as well with social media. Like if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I was like, well, actually, if you watch any magic trick on television, it always involves a live audience. Like I've never seen a magic trick 10 years ago that does not involve a live audience. But now, I mean, social media is the most popular platform for magic, and it very rarely involves an audience. Like you've got magic tricks that are just done kind of like completely in isolation, so there might be sort of like a bit of difference going on there as well.
Another question just here.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any research into perception of magic in people with schizophrenia? And has it taught us anything interesting on perception of belief?
Not that I know of. We have, like in a lot of the spiritualist experiments, we looked at schizotypy as an individual differences measure. We never really found anything, but not sort of like schizophrenia as such. I mean, I think it'd be quite hard to get ethics to do something like that research.
Do you think? Oh, sorry. Yeah, you can do.
Sorry for a follow-up question, but this has been touched on a little bit now. What are the ethical approvals like for doing magic when it involves lying and deception?
I wish you didn't ask that question. Well, I think it really, I mean, we always debrief our participants. I don't actually feel that and the debrief is really important. We never create harm. Our participants really enjoy the experiments as well, especially the placebo stuff. I mean, we've got like 4 groups running these placebo studies, and the subjects love it. I mean, it's just really fun. I mean, I think I have less ethical issues about getting someone to have an experience where they've got their mind read and stuff like that, compared to getting them to spend an hour listening to tone sequences and having to make discriminations that they feel are completely impossible to do.
Well, that's
So,
I guess especially also you mentioned the seance stuff where.
Yeah, and I mean there we fully debrief, and we are very careful as well. I mean, none of the participants are allowed to leave kind of like without having had a debrief, because kind of like. But again, there, I mean, we've tested thousands of participants using these seance studies in big. I've never had a complaint from any of the students. And they. At the end, they find it a really enjoyable experience, and they've learned something from it as well. And I think that's more to be said than probably for most of visual search tasks.
And we see bigger experiments going on in mass media anyway, don't we? When we look at what's happening on the internet and how politicians are even using some of the effects, some of the technologies that magicians might use. We see that happening across whole continents, don't we?
And and I guess from an ethics point of view, I would argue that actually the kind of magic the debrief and the debriefs do work. I mean, actually it's been quite hard to shift people's beliefs in spirituality, but actually the debrief has got a significant impact on reducing people's paranormal beliefs, and that stays for kind of like a week or 2 weeks afterwards as well. So, but yeah, it's a bit of a tricky one.
Very quick, because we'll have drinks later. There's a lot of discussion in the cognition of belief between the religiosity studies, right, and the magic thinking. It's something that you have discussed. You just mentioned the evangelist and all of those things, but it feels that theoretically, conceptually, this is really a messy part of cognition. Of course, it's very early days, but I thought you might have some thoughts about it.
Yeah, I do have some. I mean, we've been focusing mostly, like with a lot of the spiritualists, we've been focusing on paranormal beliefs. And I feel more comfortable about doing that. And you sort of like touching on something that people feel less touchy about, rather than just sort of like dealing with religion. but all kind of like political. I mean, it's sort of like the work that we've been doing on misinformation as well. I think kind of like using these paranormal experiences provides us with a really nice model to look at the general impact that some of this misinformation can have on people's beliefs and beliefs about things that are sort of like strongly ingrained in us. We haven't really touched that much on religion. I sort of feel, I guess I'd sort of be more cautious about sort of like using religion as a paradigm to look at this, but I think probably the mechanisms are going to be really quite similar as well.
So you're happy to tell the people they are ghosts, but not the Holy Ghost? Sorry, no need to answer that.
Well, I just tell them about the things that we do. I guess I never tell them ghosts don't exist. I don't know whether ghosts exist or not. All I'm telling them is that this was not a real ghost, or we did not genuinely read your mind. This was a sort of a stooge, or I used an electronic device to read your mind. So that's, as an experiment, I don't feel comfortable about kind of like making those kind of claims. I just talk about the things that we do in that context.
One more question, I think, is back there.